Well, hello and welcome to a rainy Scotland. Today we have no electricity here because they are replacing a pole that's down at the bottom of the garden. And I decided that rather than hang around here worrying about them crashing into the garden with their big digger, I would head out and take you with me. I hadn't quite banked on the rain, but there we go. It's Scotland. No such thing as bad weather, just poor clothing choice. So I am wrapped up. I have my wellies in the car and I'm going to take you somewhere really, really special. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but I tend to only go to the kind of tourist places around here when we have friends coming up to stay. I very, very rarely go on my own, and yet I love visiting places on my own. So today I am going to take you about 20 minutes drive to the Lake of Menteith, where there is an island with a 13th century priory on it, which is really important in Scotland's history. It's connected to Mary Queen of Scots when she was a child, and I thought that we'll go there and we'll go across in the little boat and I'll give you a little tour. So first of all, let's get in the car. Let's go. So here I am in the boathouse, keeping out the rain until the boat comes back to get me. Inchmahome Priory is managed by Historic Scotland, and you get a boat from here, it's a lovely wee boathouse, along that jetty off to the island. So the chap I met here says he's going to be back to pick me up in about 10 minutes. So here we are, Lake of Menteith. And the Lake of Menteith is known to be the only lake in Scotland. This is one of its claims to fame. Everything else is a loch, but actually it's probably more of a misunderstanding when making an official map. So the whole of this area is the Menteith land, and it's likely that the map maker asked about the loch and asked for the name of it and was told that it was the Lay of Menteith, which means the lowlands of Menteith, as opposed to the hills that you can see all around us, and that he wrote that down as lake because he was from England and water bodies are lakes. But it has stuck through the centuries, so the Lake of Menteith is the only lake in Scotland. Everything else is a loch. And it has been an important place for millennia. Originally, this island, Inchmahome Island, that we're going to, it had lots of crannogs, which are kind of wooden defensive structures coming out of it, a bit like spokes on the wheel. And they tend to be alder wood sunk into the bed of the lake, and then a platform on top of that, and then some kind of building on top of that. And I mean, they were used as dwelling places and workshops and so on, but they were really, really useful for defence. You'd be able to see somebody coming, you'd be able to work out who they were before they actually got to your island. But of course, crannogs don't tend to survive, except in sort of archaeological form. And what is on the island is a ruined priory from the 13th century. So in the 13th century, the Earls of Menteith were over on another island on this lake. It is called Inchmahome, and that is where they had their castle. There is still ruins of a castle there. And they didn't have a kind of garden there, but they used Inchmahome as their garden. And in 1236, I think it was, certainly early 13th century, they decided to give over half of the island to the Augustinians to build a priory. And part of that is, of course, that you're getting kind of brownie points for yourself in religious terms, that the canons who are living in the priory will be praying for you, and that should fast track you up to heaven when the time comes. So half of the island is this ruined priory, and half of it is still a kind of a pleasure garden. And of course we see this priory, which has been ruined for years and years, centuries really, and you see it as big spaces and bare stone, and really quite a romantic, spare, ruined kind of space. But of course, in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, when it was at its height, this would have been a really lavishly decorated space. It was painted inside. All of these plain stone walls would have been plastered and reinforced and have wood on them, and the wood would be painted. The big arched windows would have been stained glass. The actual big spaces were divided up into much smaller spaces by wooden screens, and these were painted and gilded. So, it is, at its heyday, this maximalist, really vibrant, gold and red and blue kind of space. It wasn't anything like the way that it looks today. And this was the home to 10 to 15 canons. Augustinians went out into the kind of parishes to do God's work, and when they were in the priory, their main role was to pray. So their routine was 2:30, they got up and started praying. More prayers at 5 o'clock, then lots of services, masses, things through the day, and they went to bed at 6:30. They had one meal a day, and they didn't eat meat. Sometimes they had fish, which is probably quite good because they were surrounded by this kind of amazing lake that would have had lots of fish. But it was a very, very simple life devoted to religious worship, as opposed to some other monasteries where people would be, brewing and have lots of fields and be in the wool trade and that kind of thing. This Augustinian priory was really to do with praying. And one thing that I wanted to show you or here is a memorial sculpture, which used to be in the priory church, and it has been moved into this kind of mausoleum to keep it away from all the elements. And you can see that centuries of Scottish rain and wind have rather eaten away at the stone. But this is the kind of memorial sculpture of Walter Stewart, who was Earl of Menteith, and his countess, who's called Mary. And he was Earl of Menteith in the mid 13th century. And at a time when memorials tend to be the figures lying on their backs, little dog at their feet, hands in prayer, this memorial instead has the couple turned to each other and embracing. The dogs are still there, but they're not kind of as supine as normal, not as well behaved as normal. And the couple are embracing, which is very moving. And Walter survived Mary by 10 years. So during that 10 years after her death, he must have been planning this memorial stone and getting it made. It's rather amazing. There are also some other beautiful stones here with Celtic interlacing and so on, which are just beautiful. But the thing that Inchmahome is best known for, and the bit that I will be sure to tag in this video, is that when she was 4, Mary Queen of Scots came here for 3 weeks. Now, Mary Queen of Scots had inherited the Scottish throne when she was 6 days old. Her father had died very young. Her 2 older brothers had died in infancy. And all of Scotland's hopes for some form of stability was on this infant baby girl. Almost immediately, the monarchs in Europe started to kind of vie with each other as marriage prospects for Scotland's new queen, even though she was, a baby in arms. Scotland at the time, it was a poor country. It doesn't have many exports at the time. It's, there is salted preserved fish. There are fighting men. There's a very rough kind of wool. The weather is not great. There is no roads infrastructure, so everything is done by sea. There are whole parts of the country which are pretty much inaccessible. However, as a strategic country, being just across the border from England, which was a very powerful country, Scotland kind of punched above its weight in terms of whether its queen was marriageable. So originally there was an agreement called the Greenwich Treaty, where Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, was to marry Edward, who was the young son of Henry VIII. And that was all agreed and signed by Scottish government, so nobles agreed to that. And then, not long after that, they changed their minds and they tore up the Treaty of Greenwich and they started talking to the French. And that started what is known as the rough wooing of Scotland, where Henry VIII, in an attempt to change the Scots' minds, started attacking Scotland all the way up the east coast to Edinburgh, going to Edinburgh, setting bits of Edinburgh on fire. I grew up in East Lothian, which is about 20 miles. I grew up 20 miles away from Edinburgh. And I remember the thrill of digging in the garden and finding this Tudor cannonball from that time. But it actually wasn't that rare because they were sailing up and they were just firing any villages on the coast. And there was a lot of battles and things. And at the Battle of Pinkie Cleugh in 1547, the Scots were annihilated. And Marie de Guise decided that rather than risk her baby daughter being snatched, she should flee. So she packed up her entourage, she grabbed Mary Queen of Scots, and they headed for Inchmahome Island. It's known as the Island of Rest. It's very peaceful, surrounded by this water. It's relatively easy to get to from Stirling, which is, one of the big palaces. And that is where she took baby. It was also, she knew the owners really well. They were guardians to Mary anyway. It was somewhere that she could go. So she went and she stayed in the priory with baby Mary for 3 weeks before they went to Stirling Castle, which had really been, they brought in all of the troops and it was well barricaded, things, and that would be even safer. And then this was before Mary went off to France, where she grew up in France. So what I find, people concentrate on Mary Queen of Scots, who was 4 at the time. But actually, I think that, this is a Marie de Guise thing. Her husband had died much younger than one would expect. Her 2 sons had died in their infancy, and she had this baby who was Queen of Scotland at 6 days old, and whose power, whose rights she really wanted to defend and keep and things. The Guises were an incredibly powerful family within France, so she had grown up knowing about power and diplomacy and being a really strong woman. I mean, she was wooed by Henry VIII, and she was very, Marie de Guise was very striking. She was almost 6 foot tall, and she replied to him to the effect of, I may be a big strong woman, but my neck is too small to be coming anywhere near you as a wife, because you are just chopping heads off. So she was a very strong woman, and she brought her child here for, as I say, just 3 weeks. But there are a lot of tales about Mary Queen of Scots on the island, and one is that she planted a box kind of bower, a bower of boxwood that is in a circle. And, people go, well, yeah, it's like she slept in every bed of Scotland. But actually, if you've had, small children to entertain in a rural area, it is quite possible that you take out, these 4-year-olds and you let them plant some box trees just to have an activity to do, particularly when all of the adults are going to be in a state of high stress, but still wanting to keep the children on board. So I think it's quite possible that the box trees were planted by Marie de Guise and Mary Queen of Scots. But the tale became so popular and the day trip to the island became so popular in the 19th century that people started taking bits of boxwood home with them. And within a decade, the box trees were no longer. So they had to plant them again in 1859, and that is the ones that are actually still here. They are not right back to Tudor times, because those ones were all picked by people wanting a souvenir of their trip. And sitting here in this really ancient woodland, surrounded by water, and still the only person on the island, I really recommend doing tourist attractions in the rain. Seemingly the island was completely mobbed yesterday because it was sunny, but today it's really quiet and peaceful, and I'm looking out and the branches are touching the water and it's just gentle, gentle rain. And you get the feeling of the peacefulness and how people over the centuries have come here for refuge, for peace, for a chance to regroup and sort themselves out. Whether that was, the monks in this Augustinian order, or whether it was Mary Guise fleeing with her 4-year-old to try and evade kidnap. You can see why they came here. And I don't think that it was solely the fact that the water gave them more security or that they knew the owner. Anyway, if you're ever in the area, get the boat out to Inchmahome Priory, have a look around the priory, have a good wander in the woods and spend some time just looking out over that water.